Before this story begins, subscribe right now, because today's story starts with betrayal, but ends with a revelation no one saw coming. On their wedding anniversary, he abandoned his pregnant wife to marry his powerful boss, believing he was choosing a better future. But the moment her secret inheritance surfaced, the man who walked away realized he had just lost the most valuable person in his entire life. If you love emotional stories filled with shocking betrayals, billionaire secrets, powerful comebacks, and unforgettable revenge transformations, hit subscribe now, because this story is about to prove that some people only recognize true love after they've destroyed. The scent of burning vanilla wax still lingered in the air, a cruel mockery of the celebration that was supposed to happen. Instead, the shattered fragments of a porcelain dinner plate lay scattered across the hardwood floor, mirroring the clean, violent break in Elena Dunois's heart. She stood frozen in the center of the dim living room, her fingers trembling violently as they pressed against her still flat abdomen. Inside her grew a fragile, microscopic life, a secret she had spent the last 3 weeks wrapping in dreams of tiny socks and shared laughter. Outside, the taillights of a sleek black sedan bled red into the pouring rain, speeding away into the dark city skyline. Inside that car was Julian, her husband of 3 years. Or rather, the man she thought was her husband, until 20 minutes ago when he walked through the door, looked past the candlelight, and handed her an envelope containing a signed petition for divorce. He didn't just walk out on their anniversary. He walked out for a promotion. He walked out for status. He walked out to step directly into the bed and the boardroom of Victoria Vance, the billionaire CEO of Vance Global Media. A marriage is an investment, Elena. Julian's voice echoed in her head, cold, clinical, and completely stripped of the warmth that had captivated her for 4 years. And frankly, you've become a stagnant asset. Victoria can give me the world. You can only give me a budget. He hadn't even given her the chance to hand him the silver gift box sitting on the mantel. Inside it was a positive pregnancy test and a pair of knitted booties. He had simply packed his designer suitcases already waiting by the door, and left her standing in the wreckage of a life they had built from scratch. Elena sank to her knees right there on the cold floor, ignoring the sharp sting of a porcelain shard biting into her palm. Physical pain was nothing compared to the suffocating vacuum in her chest. She was completely alone. Her bank account was nearly depleted from supporting Julian's ambitious climb up the corporate ladder over the last 2 years. She had no family left in the city, her job at the local library paid just enough to cover rent, and a tiny, innocent heartbeat was now entirely dependent on her survival. She looked up at the mantel, tears blinding her vision as the rain lashed violently against the window pane. Julian thought he was stepping into a life of untouchable power, leaving his stagnant asset behind to drown in poverty and shame. But as Elena clutched her stomach, a fierce, primal spark of defiance flared through the agonizing heartbreak. He didn't know about the child. And he certainly didn't know about the phone call that would ring on her old, cracked cell phone in exactly 12 hours. A call from a prestigious international legal firm that would unearth a dormant, staggering family lineage, turning her from a discarded, pregnant wife into the sole heir of a hidden billion-dollar empire. How far will a man go when he realizes he traded a genuine queen for a gilded cage? And what happens when he discovers that the woman he broke now holds the keys to the very world he sacrificed his soul to enter? The rain did not stop by morning. It settled into a miserable gray fog that hung low over the city, mirroring the heavy numbness that had taken up residence in Elena Dunois's chest. She had not slept. She had spent the entire night sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the digital clock on the nightstand count down the hours of her new, terrifying reality. Her deepest desire had always been simple: a peaceful, stable family. Growing up as an orphan raised by an eccentric, distant uncle who passed away when she was barely 18, Elena had never known the warmth of a full house. She had spent her youth moving between temporary apartments, learning to find solace in the quiet pages of books. When she met Julian, she believed her long search for a home was finally over. He had been charming, driven, and seemingly devoted. For 3 years she had gladly played the role of the supportive wife, working extra shifts at the city's central archival library, packing his lunches, and managing their tight budget so he could focus entirely on his rapid ascent within Vance Global Media. Her deepest fear was precisely what had just happened: being utterly abandoned, discarded like an expired contract when she was at her most vulnerable. System of betrayal. At precisely 8 a.m. Elena's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. For a fraction of a second, a foolish, desperate surge of hope shot through her veins. Maybe he realized he made a mistake. Maybe it was a nightmare. She scrambled to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs. But the name flashing on the screen wasn't Julian's. It was Clara Albright, her closest friend and co-worker at the library. Elena picked up, her voice thick and raspy. Clara. Elena, oh my God, don't look at the news. Clara's voice came rushing through the speaker, tight with panic and uncharacteristic anger. Just stay away from social media today. Please tell me you're at home. Elena's hand froze over the counter. Claire, what is it? Julian left me last night. He filed for divorce. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the other end of the line. He already did? That miserable, calculating snake. Elena, it's all over the business tabloids and internal press releases. Vance Global Media just announced a major leadership restructuring. Julian has been promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations. But that's not all. There's a press photo. He's standing right next to Victoria Vance at a gala from 2 nights ago. The caption calls him her fiancé. They are announcing their upcoming wedding, Elena. They're framing it as a powerhouse corporate union. The world tilted on its axis. 2 nights ago. That meant Julian had been planning this for months. Every time he stayed late at the office, every time he claimed he was traveling for a regional conference, he was auditioning for the role of Victoria Vance's new husband. He hadn't just walked out on their anniversary. He had orchestrated a calculated, highly publicized transition from his quiet life with Elena into a high-society circus. He used you, Elena, Clara whispered, her tone shifting into deep, protective empathy. He used your salary to pay for his tailored suits, his business dinners, his presentation coaching. He built his entire launchpad using your bones, and the moment he lifted off, he kicked you away. I'm pregnant, Clara, Elena whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. The silence on the line was deafening. You're what? I found out 3 weeks ago, Elena said, a lone tear cutting through the dried salt tracks on her cheek. I was going to tell him last night. I had the booties. I had the test. He didn't even let me speak. Listen to me, Clara said fiercely. You are not going to let him see you bleed. I'm coming over right now. We are going to figure this out. You have a baby to think about now, and we are going to make sure that man pays every single cent of child support he owes you, even if we have to fight Victoria Vance's entire legal team to get it. The architecture of the enemy. To understand the sheer scale of the mountain Elena was facing, one had to understand Victoria Vance. Victoria was a woman chiseled from ice and corporate ambition. At 35, she had inherited a massive media empire and expanded it with ruthless efficiency. She didn't view people as human beings. She viewed them as chess pieces. Julian Dunois was a particularly handsome, highly capable piece. He possessed the sharp intelligence and desperate, hungry ambition that Victoria could easily manipulate. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a trophy who could execute her commands in the boardroom and look impeccable on her arm at the annual winter galas. Julian, blinded by the sudden glitter of private jets, penthouse meetings and 5-figure wristwatches, had willingly swallowed the bait. He had convinced himself that Elena was a limitation, a sweet, simple girl who belonged in a small apartment, while he belonged in the skyscrapers overlooking the clouds. Elena hung up the phone with Clara, her knees shaking so violently she had to hold onto the edge of the kitchen sink. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She looked pale, exhausted and broken. How am I going to survive this? She thought, her hand instinctively dropping to her stomach. The cost of prenatal care, the rent on this apartment which Julian had already stated he would stop paying by the end of the month, the impending legal fees of a high-profile divorce. It was an avalanche designed to crush her. Right then, at exactly 8:45 a.m., her phone rang a second time. The caller ID displayed an unknown international number. It wasn't Clara. It wasn't Julian. Elena wiped her eyes, swallowing the lump of sorrow in her throat and pressed answer. Hello. Am I speaking with Mrs. Elena Dunois, formerly Elena Thorne? A crisp, authoritative voice with a distinct British accent asked. The tone was professional, elite, and carried the weight of immense institutional power. Yes, this is she, Elena replied, her brow furrowing in confusion. Mrs. Dunois, my name is Alistair Sterling. I am the senior managing partner at Sterling Cross and Associates based in London. We represent the private estate of the late Arthur Thorne. Elena blinked, her heart skipping a beat. Arthur Thorne? My great-uncle Arthur? He passed away over 8 years ago. He was a reclusive carpenter. He didn't have an estate. A low, measured chuckle came from the other end of the wire, a sound that carried the weight of a massive hidden truth. With all due respect, Mrs. Dunois, your Uncle Arthur was many things, but a simple carpenter was not one of them. That was a carefully constructed identity to maintain his absolute privacy. Arthur Thorne was the founder and primary shareholder of Thorne Maritime and Continental Holdings. For the past 8 years, per his strict testamentary instructions, his entire wealth has been held in a blind, compounding trust, undergoing a rigorous verification process to ensure absolute security from outside predators. Alistair Sterling paused, letting the silence stretch until the ambient hum of the phone line felt heavy with destiny. The trust has officially cleared its final probate cycle today. As his sole living relative and designated beneficiary, you are now the exclusive owner of the Thorne estate. The liquid assets alone total approximately $1.4 billion, excluding the global real estate portfolio and controlling shares in 3 major shipping conglomerates. Elena's breath trapped itself entirely in her lungs. The kitchen seemed to spin. The gray rain outside looked suddenly distant, like a scene from a movie she was no longer watching. I think you have the wrong person, she stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment. My husband just left me because we can't afford. We do not make mistakes, Miss Thorne, Sterling interrupted gently, intentionally dropping her married surname. We have been monitoring your life closely to ensure your safety until this day. We are fully aware of Mr. Julian Dunois' recent actions. In fact, our legal team is already reviewing his divorce petition. I assure you he has made the most catastrophic financial and personal miscalculation of his life. A private transport is currently en route to your location. My associates will arrive in 20 minutes to secure your safety and transition you to your new residence. Your life as a spectator is over, Miss Thorne. It is time to take your seat at the head of the table. Elena lowered the phone, her hands dropping to her sides. The silence of the apartment was no longer suffocating. It was electric. She walked slowly back into the living room. She looked at the silver gift box on the mantel, the one containing the proof of her pregnancy. A new, fierce coldness settled over her features, replacing the devastating sorrow that had broken her just an hour prior. Julian wanted a life of power. He wanted a woman who could give him the world. He had abandoned his child and his wife for a seat at Victoria Vance's table, entirely unaware that the quiet, supportive woman he left behind now owned the very ground the Vance empire was built upon. She picked up the silver box and slid it into her purse. She wouldn't tell him. Not yet. She would let him have his glamorous corporate wedding. She would let him tie his fate to Victoria Vance. And when he was completely trapped in that gilded cage of greed, she would show him the true definition of power. The sound of heavy, luxury vehicles pulling up to the curb outside echoed through the rain. Elena didn't look back at the shattered porcelain on the floor. She walked out the door, leaving her old life behind in the dark. The transition from the cramped, fading apartment to the penthouse suite of the Grand Windsor Hotel happened with dizzying, terrifying speed. By mid-afternoon, Elena found herself sitting across a massive mahogany desk from Alistair Sterling himself. The British attorney looked exactly as he sounded on the phone. Impeccable, calculating, and radiating an aura of absolute authority. Beside him sat a stack of legal documents thicker than any encyclopedia Elena had ever catalogued at the library. Your Uncle Arthur was a visionary, Miss Thorne, Alistair said, sliding a sleek fountain pen across the polished wood toward her. He knew that sudden wealth could ruin a young mind. That is why he mandated the 8-year freeze. He wanted you to understand the value of labor, of humility, and of genuine human connection. He wanted you to find out who people truly are when you have nothing to offer them but your heart. Elena let out a bitter, humorless laugh, her fingers tracing the edge of the heavy gold pen. Well, I certainly found out. Indeed, Alistair's eyes darkened, a cold glint appearing in his gaze. Mr. Julian Dunois has proven himself to be exceptionally short-sighted. He signed his own divorce petition last night, waiving any rights to your personal property in exchange for a quick, quiet exit. He wanted to ensure you couldn't claim a single dollar of his new Vance Global salary. He has no idea that by signing that waiver he legally barred himself from ever touching a single cent of the Thorne inheritance. I don't want his money, Alistair, Elena said, her voice strengthening, the raw grief from the night before hardening into a solid, unyielding core of determination. But he is not going to erase my child. I want him to watch us rise. I want him to see everything he discarded, completely out of his reach. And he will, Alistair replied with a sharp, satisfied smile. But first we must secure your position. Tomorrow night is the annual Global Media Vanguard Gala. It is the biggest event of the fiscal year, hosted by Vance Global Media. Victoria Vance and Julian are using this event to publicly announce their engagement and cement Julian's new role as Senior Vice President. It was meant to be his coronation. I suggest we make it his reckoning. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. The shy, quiet librarian inside her screamed at the thought of stepping into a den of corporate wolves. But then she felt the subtle protective instinct in her lower abdomen. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the heir to the Thorne Empire. What do I need to do? She asked firmly. The unexpected encounter. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of high-end tailoring, asset transfers, and security briefings. Elena was no longer wearing her worn-out cardigans and faded jeans. She was draped in a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown that discreetly concealed her early pregnancy while highlighting her striking classic elegance. When the sleek, armored limousine pulled up to the red carpet of the Vanguard Gala, the flashbulbs of hundreds of paparazzi erupted into a blinding wall of light. Elena stepped out, her head held high, her arm resting lightly on the arm of Alistair Sterling, who accompanied her as her legal counsel. The security guards at the door, seeing Alistair's exclusive VVIP credentials, immediately bowed and opened the heavy glass doors into the grand ballroom. The room was a sea of diamonds, tuxedos, and champagne flutes. High above the crowd, on an elevated VIP mezzanine, stood Julian. He looked devastatingly handsome in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo, his arm wrapped tightly around the waist of Victoria Vance. Victoria looked regal, cold, and entirely victorious as she introduced Julian to a circle of high-ranking international investors. Elena felt a momentary wave of suffocating panic. This was the man who had slept beside her 48 hours ago. This was the man who had promised to love her forever, now looking at another woman with the same manufactured smile. Deep breaths, Miss Thorne, a deep, rich voice murmured from her left. Elena turned sharply, her eyes colliding with a pair of intense, piercing gray eyes. The man standing beside her was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed an effortless, commanding presence that made even Alistair Sterling look secondary. He held a crystal glass of dark amber liquid, a faint, intrigued smile playing on his lips. I apologize if I startled you, the man said, raising his glass in a polite toast. I couldn't help but notice you looking at the stage like a warrior sizing up an enemy fortress. I'm Dominic Cavell. Elena's breath hitched slightly. Dominic Cavell. She knew that name. Anyone who read a financial newspaper knew that name. He was the reclusive, brilliant CEO of Cavell International, the chief global rival to Vance Media, and a man known for his absolute intolerance for corporate corruption. Elena Thorne, she replied, intentionally using her maiden name. Dominic's eyes flicked to her face, a sudden sharp glint of recognition and profound intrigue passing through his gaze. Thorne? As in the late Arthur Thorne. You knew my uncle? Elena asked, surprised. He was a mentor to me in my early days, Miss Thorne, Dominic said, his voice dropping into a softer, incredibly sincere tone. He was a man of immense honor. When he disappeared from the public eye, many thought he had lost his edge. I knew better. He was protecting something precious. Looking at you right now. I see he succeeded. A genuine blush crept up Elena's neck, the first warm emotion she had felt in days. There was an intense, undeniable magnetic pull between them, an instant, unspoken understanding that went far deeper than a casual gala introduction. Dominic didn't look at her like an asset or a trophy. He looked at her with a profound, protective respect that made her feel safe amidst the wolves. The first major twist before Elena could respond, the overhead lights dimmed, and a spotlight focused on the main stage. Victoria Vance stepped up to the microphone, her sharp, clinical voice echoing through the massive ballroom. Ladies and gentlemen, corporate partners and distinguished guests, Victoria announced, her hand reaching out to draw Julian to her side. Tonight, Vance Global Media doesn't just celebrate our highest quarterly revenue in a decade. Tonight we celebrate a new era. It is my absolute privilege to introduce my new partner, both in life and in executive leadership, our new senior vice president and my brilliant fiancé, Julian Dunois. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Julian stepped forward, beaming with arrogant pride, taking the microphone. "Thank you, Victoria," Julian said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "When you build a vision from the ground up, you quickly realize that to reach the absolute pinnacle of success, you must surround yourself with those who match your caliber. You must cut away the dead weight, the limitations of the past, and commit entirely to the future. Together Victoria and I are going to. I believe your future just encountered an unexpected audit, Mr. Dumas." A clear, powerful voice interrupted from the center of the ballroom floor. The applause died instantly. The room fell into a suffocating, dead silence. Every head in the ballroom turned toward the source of the voice. Standing directly beneath the crystal chandeliers, flanked by the formidable Alistair Sterling and the ultra-powerful Dominic Cavell, was Elena. Julian froze on stage, the microphone trembling slightly in his grip as his face drained of all color. He stared down at Elena, his mind violently short-circuiting. What is she doing here? How did she get past security? Where did she get that gown? Elena. Julian stammered into the microphone, his polished veneer cracking completely in front of 300 elite guests. What is the meaning of this? Security, please escort this woman out. She is a disgruntled former acquaintance. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Dunois. Alistair Sterling stepped forward, his voice carrying the terrifying weight of an impending legal execution. This woman is Ms. Elena Thorne. And she does not require an invitation to an event hosted in a venue her family trust purchased entirely at 4 p.m. this afternoon. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Victoria Vance's eyes narrowed into dangerous, lethal slits. She stepped in front of Julian, glaring down at Elena. "I don't care who your lawyers are, girl. This is a private Vance Global event. You have no authority here." "Actually, Victoria, she does." Dominic Cavell spoke up, his powerful voice cutting through the tension like a blade as he stepped right to Elena's side, his hand subtly and supportively resting on the small of her back. "As of 2 hours ago, Thorne Maritime and Continental Holdings acquired 49% of the outstanding debt bonds of Vance Global Media. Elena Thorne is now your primary institutional creditor. If I were you, I would be exceptionally polite to the woman who currently holds the keys to your entire corporate liquidity." Julian felt the ground completely vanish beneath his feet. He stared at the gorgeous, radiant woman he had abandoned in a dark apartment just 24 hours ago. The woman he told was a stagnant asset, who could only give him a budget. She wasn't begging for child support. She wasn't crying over his betrayal. She was standing next to his most powerful billionaire rival, holding the financial leash to his entire future. Elena looked up at Julian on the stage, her expression completely calm, devoid of the tears that had ruined her face the night before. "Enjoy your engagement party, Julian," Elena said softly, her voice carrying beautifully across the silent room. "Because tomorrow morning the rent is due." The fallout from the Global Media Vanguard Gala was instantaneous and catastrophic. By sunrise, the business tabloids and financial news networks were completely blind to the announcement of Julian and Victoria's engagement. Instead, every headline screamed about the mysterious overnight emergence of Elena Thorne, the reclusive billionaire heir who now held 49% of Vance Global Media's debt bonds. For Julian, the morning brought a waking nightmare. He sat in Victoria's sleek high-rise office, the glass windows overlooking the city no longer feeling like a triumph, but like a dizzying drop. "Explain this to me, Julian." Victoria's voice was dangerously quiet, a razor-thin edge slicing through the room. She didn't look at him. She stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her designer suit. "You told me she was a librarian. You told me she was an orphan with no background, no family, and absolutely no leverage. You assured me that cutting her loose would be clean, fast, and entirely without consequence. She was a librarian, Victoria. I swear to you." Julian stammered, his polished corporate confidence completely shattered. He paced back and forth across the plush rug, his fingers tugging at his collar. We lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment for 3 years. She bought her clothes from thrift stores. She tracked every single dollar we spent on groceries. There is no way she had this kind of money. It has to be some kind of elaborate hoax, a setup orchestrated by Dominic Cavell to destabilize us. Dominic Cavell doesn't play with hoaxes, Julian. He plays with executions. Victoria turned slowly, her eyes flashing with a cold, predatory anger. The debt bonds are real. The Thorne estate is real. Your pathetic, quiet little wife currently has her hand wrapped around the windpipe of my company. If she calls in those bonds before the end of the fiscal quarter, our stock will plummet, our investors will pull out, and the board will have my head on a spike. And because you are legally tied to me now, your new precious senior vice presidency will evaporate before you even receive your first paycheck. Julian felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. The glittering world of luxury he had traded his soul for was suddenly looking like a trap door. Fix this, Victoria hissed, stepping closer until she was inches from his face, her expensive perfume suffocating him. I don't care how you do it. You know her. You know her weaknesses. You know what makes her tick. Find out what she wants, buy her off, or find a way to discredit her. If you don't neutralize this threat, Julian, our engagement is over, and I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every boardroom from here to London. A different kind of sanctuary. While the Vance empire scrambled in a panic, Elena was experiencing a completely different world. Under the meticulous care of Alistair Sterling, she had been moved to a breathtaking private estate on the outskirts of the city. A sprawling, historic manor surrounded by ancient oak trees and high stone walls. A property that had belonged to her uncle Arthur. For the first time in days, Elena felt a sense of peace. She sat in the glass-walled sunroom, a warm cup of herbal tea resting between her hands. Clara sat across from her, staring out at the manicured gardens in absolute disbelief. I still think I'm dreaming, Clara said, shaking her head with a wide, stunned smile. Elena, you're an actual literal billionaire. I went to bed thinking about how we were going to afford baby formula, and I woke up to find out you own the bank. Elena smiled softly, but her eyes remained guarded. She placed a hand over her abdomen, where the tiny life continued to grow in secret. The money doesn't change anything about who I am, Clara. But it changes everything about how I can protect this child. Julian would have crushed me in court. He would have left me with nothing, and he would have laughed while doing it. Now, he can't touch us. The heavy oak doors of the sunroom opened, and a house steward stepped in, bowing slightly. Miss Thorne, Mr. Dominic Cavell has arrived for your scheduled meeting. Elena's pulse quickened, a sudden, unfamiliar flutter stirring in her chest. Dominic walked into the room, stripping off his heavy charcoal overcoat to reveal a perfectly tailored dark gray suit. He didn't carry the arrogant, predatory energy that Julian always projected when entering a room. Instead, Dominic radiated a calm, grounding strength. He carried a small, elegantly wrapped basket, which he placed gently on the table. Good morning, Elena. Ms. Albright. Dominic nodded politely to Clara before focusing his intense, warm gray eyes entirely on Elena. I brought some fresh pastries from a small bakery near my office. I remembered your Uncle Arthur used to love their almond croissants. I hoped you might share the taste. Thank you, Dominic, Elena said, genuinely touched by the gesture. Please sit. As Clara discreetly excused herself to explore the estate's massive library, Dominic took a seat across from Elena. The professional distance between them began to soften, replaced by a deep, magnetic tension that had been brewing since their first look at the gala. We need to discuss your next steps, Dominic said, his tone shifting into one of strategic partnership, yet his eyes remained profoundly gentle. Victoria Vance is a cornered animal right now. She has built her entire identity on being untouchable. Now that you hold her debt, she's going to strike back. She is already ordering her PR teams to dig into your past, looking for any scandal, any vulnerability they can use to paint you as a fraud in the media. Elena looked down at her tea, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. There is no scandal in my past, Dominic. I lived a quiet, simple life. The only mistake I ever made was believing in Julian. That wasn't a mistake, Elena. That was empathy, Dominic said softly, reaching across the table. His large, warm hand hovered just inches from hers, offering support without forcing his presence. Julian's inability to value your loyalty is his failure, not yours. Don't let his greed make you look back at your own kindness with regret. Elena looked up, meeting his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes was disarming. For years, Julian had subtly made her feel small, constantly implying that her simple desires and quiet nature were a drag on his ambition. But Dominic looked at her as if her quiet strength was the most formidable force he had ever encountered. A powerful, undeniable attraction was growing between them, built not on corporate convenience, but on a profound mutual recognition of each other's true character. The red herring. By the middle of the week, the first counterstrike from the Vance camp arrived, but it wasn't what Elena expected. Alistair Sterling marched into the estate's study, holding a legal brief with a grim expression. "Miss Thorne, we have a situation. A prominent financial blog has just published an anonymous leak, claiming that the Thorne Trust is fraudulent. They are implying that Arthur Thorne's true wealth was stripped away years ago during a hidden bankruptcy, and that you are using Cavil International's capital to masquerade as an heir in an illegal corporate raid on Vance Global." Elena stood up, her heart racing. "What? That's completely false. The probate records, the audits, everything is fully verified." "Of course it's false," Dominic said, stepping into the room from the adjoining terrace, his face set in stone. "This is a red herring. Victoria doesn't expect this rumor to hold up in a court of law. She wants to create enough public doubt to freeze your trading capabilities temporarily, giving her time to restructure her loans with overseas banks. It's a classic stalling tactic." "But who leaked it?" Elena asked, looking between Alistair and Dominic. The trust documents were heavily guarded. Only a few people had access to the filings. "We found the leak source," Alistair said, sliding a printout of an encrypted email across the desk. "The metadata traces back to an IP address registered to a small private accounting firm. A firm that was recently hired by Miss Clara Albright." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She stumbled back a step, her hand instinctively flying to her mouth. Clara? Her best friend? The woman who had held her hand while she cried on the kitchen floor? The woman who knew about her pregnancy? "No," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "No, that's impossible. Claire would never betray me. She hates Julian more than anyone." "The evidence is stark, Elena," Dominic said, stepping closer to her, his voice tight with protective concern. "People do desperate things when immense wealth enters the equation. Victoria Vance has deeper pockets than anyone realized. It is highly probable she offered your friend a sum of money that changed her loyalty." Elena felt a profound, crushing weight settle over her. Was everyone in her life bought and paid for? Was the entire world just a marketplace where love and friendship were traded for the highest bid? Elena stood in the center of the grand study, the luxury of the estate suddenly feeling cold and hollow. She looked at Dominic, her eyes filled with a mixture of raw vulnerability and rising fury. "I don't care how much money is in my bank account," Elena said, her voice dropping into a fierce, low register that sent a shiver through the room. "If Julian thinks he can use my past or my friends to make me back down, he is gravely mistaken. I am going to face them myself." The air inside the private dining room of the Obsidian Club was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, dry red wine and cold, calculating desperation. The venue was the most exclusive establishment in the financial district, a place where multi-million-dollar mergers were finalized with a simple nod of the head. Elena sat perfectly still at the head of a long glass table, her hands folded neatly over her lap. Flanking her on the right was Alistair Sterling, his expression a mask of absolute legal indifference. To her left sat Dominic Cavil, his physical presence looming over the room like an unexploded charge. The heavy double doors opened and Julian walked in, followed closely by Victoria Vance. Julian looked exhausted. The tight skin beneath his eyes was dark with stress, and his usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled. Victoria, however, marched into the room with the posture of an empress who refused to acknowledge that her throne was on fire. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Victoria said, throwing her designer leather folder onto the glass table as she took a seat opposite Elena. "We received your formal summons for an executive debt review, Ms. Thorne. If you think this little theatrical display is going to force Vance Global into a corner, you are severely mistaken. The rumors regarding the validity of your trust are already circulating. Investors are questioning your liquidity. If you move to call in our bonds tomorrow, You will trigger a legal battle that will tie up your inheritance in probate courts for the next decade. Elena didn't blink. She looked past Victoria, her eyes locking directly onto Julian. He was staring at her with a strange, unstable mixture of profound regret and lingering arrogance. Is that what you told her, Julian? Elena asked softly, her voice cutting through Victoria's corporate posturing like a razor. Did you tell her that I'm fragile? Did you tell her that if you yell loud enough, I'll fold up into a corner and cry like I used to when we couldn't make the car payments? Elena, please, Julian said, his voice cracking as he leaned forward over the table, completely ignoring Victoria's sharp, warning glare. We need to talk reasonably. This has gotten completely out of hand. What happened between us? It was professional survival. It wasn't personal. You have to understand the pressure I was under. If you destroy Vance Global, you aren't just hurting Victoria. You're destroying the career I spent my entire life building. Everything I worked for, everything I sacrificed for us. For us. Elena let out a soft, melodic laugh that chilled the room. You signed a divorce petition on our wedding anniversary, Julian. You left a signed document on a table surrounded by candles, and you walked out into the rain to climb into another woman's car. Don't you dare use the word us. The real traitor revealed. Enough of this domestic melodrama, Victoria snapped, slamming her hand down on the table. Julian, shut your mouth. Elena, we know your strategy. We know you are relying on Clara Albright to leak internal financial documents from our archive library to bolster your case. But your little informant has been neutralized. We found the digital trail. We know she accessed our files, and we have already filed criminal corporate espionage charges against her. She will be behind bars by midnight. Elena felt her heart skip a beat, but she did not let her expression waver. She glanced at Alistair, who simply slid a slim silver laptop across the glass table toward Victoria. I believe you are misinterpreting the direction of that digital trail, Ms. Vance, Alistair said smoothly, opening the screen. On the display, a high-definition video began to play. It was a security feed from a private banking suite at the First Continental Bank, dated 2 days prior. In the video, a woman was sitting across from a bank manager, signing documents for a wire transfer of $500,000. The woman in the video wasn't Clara Albright. It was Victoria Vance's personal executive assistant, a woman who had worked by her side for 5 years. And the man sitting next to her, guiding her hand and signing as a secondary witness to the transaction, was Julian Dunois. Julian's face went completely translucent. He leaped up from his chair screeching violently against the marble floor. That's a forgery. That video is doctored. Sit down, Julian. Dominic Cavill's voice boomed through the room, a low, authoritative growl that instantly anchored Julian to the spot. Dominic leaned forward, his gray eyes flashing with lethal precision. The $500,000 didn't go to Clara Albright. It was transferred from a private shell account registered in Julian's name directly to your assistant, Victoria. Julian didn't buy off Elena's friend. He used your own corporate funds to buy off your assistant, creating a fake paper trail to frame Clara, hoping he could use the leverage to force Elena into a settlement behind your back. Victoria turned slowly, her neck stiffening as she looked up at Julian. The silence between the two of them became a physical, suffocating force. Julian. Victoria whispered, the corporate armor cracking to reveal a terrifying, psychotic rage. You used my corporate capital to cut a private deal with your ex-wife? No. Victoria, listen to me. Julian stammered, backing away from the table as his entire world imploded from the inside out. I was trying to protect us. I knew Elena wouldn't settle with you, but I thought if I could frame her friend, I could make her desperate enough to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I did it for the company. I did it for our future. You did it because you are a coward, Julian, Elena said, standing up slowly. The sheer majesty of her presence took over the room. She looked down at the man she had loved for years, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound, cleansing pity. You thought you were a chess player, but you're just a piece. You betrayed me for status, and the very first thing you did when you got that status was betray the woman who gave it to you. Shared vulnerability. Victoria didn't say another word. She stood up, grabbed her leather folder and walked out of the room, her high heels clicking like a death march down the corridor. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at Elena. Julian stood frozen for 3 seconds before scrambling after her, begging, shouting her name as the heavy double doors swung shut behind them. The room fell into a quiet, heavy stillness. The storm had broken, leaving only the wreckage behind. Elena felt the sudden, massive rush of adrenaline leave her body all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, the physical strain of the confrontation catching up to her pregnancy. Before she could lose her balance, Dominic was there. His large, strong arms wrapped around her waist, catching her gently and holding her close against his chest. He didn't let go. He held her with an immense protective tenderness, his heart beating a steady, reassuring rhythm against her cheek. "I've got you," Dominic whispered into her hair, his voice entirely stripped of his billionaire executive persona. "You're safe, Elena. It's over. You broke them." Elena buried her face in his shoulder, a single hot tear slipping past her lashes. For the first time she allowed herself to lean entirely on someone else. She felt the incredible electric warmth of his body, the absolute sincerity of his embrace. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her fingers clutching the lapel of his gray suit. "I was afraid that if I wasn't strong they would find out about the baby. They would try to use my child as a weapon." Dominic pulled back just enough to look down into her eyes, his hands gently framing her face. His gaze was fierce, unyielding, and filled with a deep, blossoming affection that went far beyond business or revenge. "They will never touch you and they will never touch your child," Dominic said with absolute certainty. "I swear to you, Elena. From this moment on, you don't have to carry this weight alone. I am standing right here with you." Elena looked into Dominic's eyes, a profound sense of hope blooming in her chest for the first time since her anniversary. She was no longer just a victim of a husband's betrayal. She was a mother, an heir, and a woman who was finally learning what it felt like to be truly cherished by a man of real honor. But as she took comfort in Dominic's arms outside the club, a desperate, ruined Julian was pulling out his phone, his eyes bloodshot as he watched Victoria's limousine speed away. He had lost his career. He had lost his billionaire fiancée. And as he stared back up at the glittering windows of the Obsidian Club, a dark, dangerous thought began to take root in his mind. He needed leverage. He needed a secret. And he was going to find out exactly what Elena was hiding, no matter the cost. The night layout of the city was a jagged line of neon and shadow, but inside the secure walls of the Thorne estate, the darkness felt intensely personal. Elena sat alone in the nursery she had begun to quietly design in the east wing. A single low lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating a beautifully carved oak crib, a piece she had commissioned from a local artisan, reminiscent of the woodwork her Uncle Arthur used to craft. She held a tiny white woolen blanket against her chest, her breathing shallow. The victory at the Obsidian Club had felt monumental, but the aftermath had left a cold, lingering dread in its wake. The human cost of war was starting to register. Her phone buzzed on the adjacent rocking chair. It was an encrypted text from Alistair Sterling. "Emergency briefing. Victoria Vance has officially filed for corporate restructuring, but she has completely cut Julian out of the legal defense. Julian's assets have been frozen by the SEC pending the fraud investigation. He has gone completely off the grid. Exercise extreme caution." Elena's hand tightened around the blanket. A man with everything to lose was dangerous. A man who had already lost everything, whose carefully constructed illusion of grandeur had been completely shattered, was unpredictable. The trap snapped shut. The following afternoon, Elena insisted on visiting the City Central Archive Library. Against Dominic's explicit protests and Alistair's security warnings, she needed a moment of normalcy. She needed to feel the weight of old paper, the smell of dust and history, the things that anchored her to the woman she was before the billions arrived. She took 2 private security guards, who remained stationed at the main entrance of the historic stone building. She walked down the isolated aisles of the rare manuscript section, the quietness of the space wrapping around her like a protective shield. "You always did look beautiful under these fluorescent lights, Elena." The voice came from behind a towering row of legal anthologies. Cold, jagged, and entirely unhinged. Elena turned sharply, her heart leaping into her throat. Julian stepped out from the shadows of the aisle. He looked unrecognizable. The bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo was gone, replaced by a wrinkled, stained trench coat. His jaw was covered in thick, dark stubble and his eyes were wide, bloodshot and frantic with a dangerous, manic energy. "Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping into a firm, guarded tone as she took a back step, her hand instinctively coming up to shield her stomach. "You shouldn't be here. My security is right at the front doors. If I scream, they will be here in 5 seconds." "Go ahead and scream," Julian whispered, taking a step forward, a heavy metallic object glinting inside his right coat pocket. "Scream and see how fast I can ruin your new little fairy tale. You think you won, don't you? You think because you have Dominic Cavell holding your hand and Alistair Sterling handling your paperwork, you're untouchable." He let out a dry, rattling laugh that echoed terrifyingly through the empty aisle. "I went back to our old apartment, Elena. I went there to look for my old tax documents before the federal investigators grabbed them. The landlord hadn't cleaned it out yet. I found the silver gift box you left on the mantel. The one you were going to give me on our anniversary." He took another step, his face twisting into a mask of pure, venomous resentment. "A pregnancy test, Elena? A pair of boots? You were carrying my child while you sat across from me at the Obsidian Club, acting like a righteous queen? You hid my heir from me. You used my own kid to frame me as the ultimate villain while you prepared to hand the Thorn Empire over to Dominic Cavell. You abandoned us, Julian." Elena fired back, her quiet reserve cracking under a surge of raw, maternal fury. "You didn't want a child. You told me I was a stagnant asset. You told me I could only give you a budget while you crawled into Victoria Vance's bed. You don't get to claim a child you were perfectly willing to leave in poverty. That child is a Dunois." Julian hissed, his hand gripping the heavy object in his pocket tightly as he closed the distance between them, trapping her against the heavy wooden bookshelf. "And more importantly, that child is the legal heir to the Thorn estate. If the public finds out that the great Elena Thorn is denying a father his parental rights, that she concealed a pregnancy to manipulate a corporate takeover, your pristine reputation is finished. The board of Thorn Holdings will remove you for ethical volatility." He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour against her ear. "Here's how this is going to go, Elena. You are going to sign over 50% of the Thorn liquid assets into a private trust under my name as the father. You are going to drop the debt collection against Vance Global so Victoria stops hunting me. If you don't, I'm going straight to the press with the medical records I just pulled from your clinic. I will drag your name through the mud until your child is born in the middle of a global media circus. The ultimate separation." Before Elena could respond, the heavy glass doors at the end of the aisle shattered inward with a deafening crash. Dominic Cavell charged through the dust, his face dark with a terrifying primal rage. He had received the tracking alert from Elena's security detail the moment Julian bypassed the perimeter. He didn't wait for his guards. He tore through the library like a hurricane. "Get away from her, Dunois!" Dominic roared. Julian panicked. Seeing the massive frame of Dominic rushing toward him, he lunged forward, grabbing Elena's arm violently to use her as a shield. Elena gasped, twisted her body to protect her abdomen, and lost her footing on the polished marble floor. She fell hard, her side striking the sharp edge of a heavy reading table before she collapsed onto the floor. "Elena!" Dominic yelled, a sound of absolute agony tearing from his throat. He didn't even look at Julian. He dropped to his knees beside Elena, his hands trembling violently as he gathered her into his arms. Julian, seeing his leverage vanish and realizing the absolute gravity of what he had just done, turned and fled down the rear fire exit, disappearing into the crowded city streets. Elena lay pale and motionless in Dominic's embrace, her eyes fluttering open slightly as a sharp, agonizing pain radiated through her lower abdomen. She clutched Dominic's jacket, her voice a desperate, broken whisper. "Dominic, the baby, please save my baby." The sirens of the emergency vehicles wailed through the pouring rain as Dominic carried Elena out of the library, his gray suit soaked with water and his heart breaking with every step. He held her tight against his chest, refusing to let the paramedics take her from him until they reached the doors of the ambulance. As the vehicle sped away toward the hospital, Dominic stood on the wet asphalt, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The love he felt for Elena had reached a point of absolute completeness, and with that love came a terrifying, lethal resolve. Julian Dunois hadn't just broken a contract. He had threatened the woman Dominic loved and the child he was already prepared to protect with his life. The dark hour had arrived and Dominic was about to show the city what happens when you try to destroy the only thing that matters. The sterilizing white glare of the hospital intensive care unit felt like a completely different universe from the opulent ballrooms and corporate high-rises. For 14 hours, the only sound in the private room was the rhythmic, agonizingly slow beep of the fetal heart monitor. Dominic Cavell had not moved from the plastic chair beside Elena's bed. His charcoal suit jacket was thrown across the floor, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms, his eyes sunken and rimmed with deep red veins. He held Elena's left hand between both of his, pressing his forehead against her knuckles as if he could infuse his own immense life force directly into her veins. Elena's eyes slowly fluttered open, the heavy fog of the sedatives lifting. The sharp pain in her abdomen had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. "Dominic," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the machinery. Dominic lifted his head instantly, his entire face transforming with a profound emotional relief that completely stripped away his billionaire armor. "Elena, stay still. Don't try to move." Her fingers panicked, clutching his hand with a sudden, desperate strength. "The baby. Dominic, tell me." The spark of life. A soft, incredibly warm smile broke through Dominic's exhausted features. He leaned over her, his large hand gently coming to rest on her abdomen, right over the hidden life they were both fighting to protect. "The baby is safe, Elena," Dominic whispered, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. "The doctors ran 3 ultrasounds. The table edge bruised your ribs, but the amniotic fluid absorbed the impact. The heartbeat is strong. Listen." He pointed to the monitor beside the bed. Elena turned her head slowly, tears of absolute gratitude spilling over her lashes as she listened to the rapid, steady thump-thump-thump echoing through the room. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a thorn refusing to be broken by a Dunois. "He tried to destroy us," Elena said, her voice instantly losing its weakness, her eyes igniting with a fierce, blinding clarity that made Dominic's heart soar. "He thought he could use my child to make me crawl. He thought because I am quiet I am easy to kill." "He was wrong," Dominic said, leaning closer until his lips gently brushed her forehead. The kiss was filled with a deep, reverent love that had grown from the ashes of their shared ordeal. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known, Elena. But you don't have to fight this from a hospital bed. While you were sleeping, Alistair and I didn't stop. Uniting for the final push." Alistair Sterling walked into the hospital room at that exact moment, a sleek digital tablet in his hand and a cold, victorious expression on his face. "Welcome back, Miss Thorne," Alistair said, bowing his head with immense respect. You called the authorities?" Julian whispered, his legs giving out completely as he sank to his knees on the filthy concrete. He looked up at Elena, his eyes wide with a pathetic, groveling desperation. "Elena, please. We were married. We shared a bed for 3 years. You loved me. You can't let them put me away for 20 years. Think of the baby. Think of our child growing up with a father in federal prison." The final twist. Elena stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. She looked down at the weeping, broken man who had once stood on a high society stage and called her a stagnant asset. He felt no hatred. She felt no anger. She felt only a profound, liberating emptiness. "You don't get to use my child as a shield, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping into a low, majestic register that cut through the sound of the rain. "And that is where your final, most catastrophic miscalculation lies. You thought you were stealing my Uncle Arthur's inheritance. You thought you were holding his wealth hostage." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a certified, stamped legal document, tossing it onto the floor in front of his knees. "Read it, Julian," she commanded softly. Julian's trembling fingers picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the dense legal script. As his gaze hit the final paragraph, his breath trapped itself entirely in his throat. This is a corporate charter transfer," Julian whispered, his head shaking in denial. "My Uncle Arthur didn't just leave me liquid cash and shipping docks, Julian," Elena explained, a beautiful, triumphant smile gracing her lips. "He was the primary underwriter for the international insurance conglomerate that holds 80% of Victoria Vance's private real estate portfolio. When you used Victoria's corporate funds to buy off her assistant and frame Clara, you didn't just commit fraud against Vance Global. You committed fraud against an entity owned entirely by the Thorne Trust. Dominic stepped forward, his hand coming to rest firmly on Elena's shoulder, a gesture of absolute, eternal unity. In short, Julian, Dominic said, looking down at him with ruthless indifference, you didn't just steal from your ex-wife. You stole from the very trust that was paying your new fiancé's mortgage. Victoria Vance filed for absolute bankruptcy 20 minutes ago. She has turned state's evidence against you to save her own skin. You aren't just going to prison, Mr. Dunois. You are entering a prison system where every single debt you owe is owned by the woman you abandoned. The sound of blaring police sirens and flashing blue and red lights finally surrounded the warehouse, reflecting off the wet glass windows. Heavily armed federal officers rushed through the doors, immediately pinning Julian to the floor and pulling his hands behind his back into cold steel handcuffs. Julian didn't fight. He wept hysterically, his forehead pressed against the dirt as he was hauled to his feet. As the officers dragged him past Elena, he looked back one last time, realizing with absolute agonizing clarity that the quiet librarian he had thrown away for temporary status was now a goddess completely beyond his universe, carrying the future king of an empire he could have shared, if he had only chosen love over greed. Elena didn't watch the police cruisers drive away. She turned her back on the flashing lights, looking up into Dominic's warm gray eyes. The storm outside was still raging, but inside her chest the war was finally over. 6 months later, the relentless gray rain that had dominated the city for nearly a year finally gave way to a brilliant, unclouded spring afternoon. The sun cast a warm, golden glow over the manicured lawns of the Thorne estate, illuminating the ancient oak trees that were now in full, vibrant bloom. Elena stood by the tall glass doors of the sunroom, a soft, serene smile resting on her lips. She looked completely different from the broken, fragile woman who had wept on a cold kitchen floor on her wedding anniversary. She wore a simple, elegant cream-colored maternity dress that beautifully accented her now prominent, undeniable pregnancy. She was 8 months along, her skin radiating the healthy, glowing warmth of a mother who had finally found absolute peace. She gently placed both hands over her rounded abdomen, feeling the soft, reassuring flutter of the life growing inside her. A life that would never know the sting of poverty, the shadow of greed, or the terror of abandonment. A fulfilling conclusion. The door to the sunroom opened quietly and Clara walked in, carrying a tray of fresh lemonade and a stack of newly catalogued historical archives. Clara had not just been vindicated. She was now the director of the newly established Thorne Foundation for Literary and Cultural Preservation, fully funded by the estate. The final audit for the Foundation's library project just cleared, Elena, Clara said, her eyes shining with immense pride and joy as she set the tray down. We are opening 3 new free public archives in the lower-income districts by the end of the month. You are changing thousands of lives, you know. We are doing it together, Clara, Elena said gently, stepping forward to wrap her friend in a warm, sincere embrace. You stood by me when I had nothing but a broken plate and a positive test. This isn't just my inheritance. It's our platform to do good. As Clara left to finalize the press releases, a heavy, familiar pair of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Dominic Cavell walked into the room. He had dropped his heavy executive briefcase at the door, his tie already loosened, his intense gray eyes softening into absolute adoration the moment they landed on Elena. He didn't say a word. He simply walked straight to her, his large, warm hands immediately finding their place over hers on her stomach. He's kicking quite a bit today, Dominic murmured, a deep, rich chuckle vibrating against Elena's shoulder as he leaned down to press a soft, lingering kiss to her neck. He knows his father is home, Elena whispered, turning in his embrace to look up into the face of the man who had become her sanctuary, her partner and her truest protector. The romantic connection between them had grown naturally, stripped of all corporate pretense. It was built on a profound foundation of shared vulnerability, respect, and a love so deep that it had completely healed the fractures of Elena's past. Dominic wasn't stepping into her life to control her wealth. He was standing beside her as an equal, ready to build a completely new legacy together. The final status. Across the country, inside the cold, uniform walls of a federal correctional facility, Julian Dunois sat on a metal bench, staring blankly at a concrete wall. His hands, once accustomed to luxury watches and expensive pens, were rough and calloused. He was serving the first year of a 20-year sentence with absolutely no possibility of parole. Every single month, his mandatory prison financial account received a minimal allowance for basic necessities. The statement on the paper always bore the same corporate issuer stamp: Thorn Continental Holdings. It was a quiet, permanent reminder of his absolute failure. He had traded a genuine, fiercely loyal queen and his own unborn flesh and blood for a temporary seat at a corporate table that had vanished like smoke. He was entirely forgotten by the world he had sacrificed his soul to enter, left to spend the rest of his days watching the woman he discarded rule that very world from afar. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching, for sharing your incredible energy in the comments, and for being the absolute best community on the internet. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button one last time and turn on that notification bell. We have so many more intensely addictive, emotional and powerful human stories coming your way very soon. Elena leaned her head against Dominic's chest as the golden spring sunlight washed over the estate. The silver gift box that had once represented her deepest heartbreak was now locked away in a private archive, a historical marker of the moment her old life ended and her true destiny began. She looked out at the horizon, her hand tightly clasped in Dominic's, completely filled with joy, fulfillment, and a beautiful, unshakable peace for the future.